38 years ago, a woman drove home from work in a quiet Louisiana town and never arrived. Her car vanished. Her body disappeared. The investigation went cold, leaving her family trapped in an endless nightmare of unanswered questions. For nearly 4 decades, her husband lit candles every Sunday, praying for just one thing. Not for her to come home, he knew that was impossible, but for the truth to finally surface. Her teenage daughter grew up without a mother, got married, had children, all while carrying the weight of not knowing what happened that July night in 1981. The police had done everything they could with the tools available back then, but forensic science in the 80s had limits. Blood typing could only narrow possibilities, not confirm identities. Without a body, without witnesses, without evidence strong enough to move forward, the case was filed away and forgotten by everyone except the family left behind. Then, decades later, a cold case detective opened a dusty box in a courthouse basement and found something the original investigators had collected but couldn't fully analyze. A piece of evidence that would crack the case wide open and reveal a betrayal so devastating it would shake an entire community to its core. The killer had been hiding in plain sight all along, living just 2 houses away, playing the role of concerned neighbor while keeping a terrible secret. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is at your location. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you can follow along as we bring justice to the forgotten. In July 1981, St. Martinville, Louisiana was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. On a humid Tuesday evening in July 1981, the air in St. Martinville hung thick and heavy, the kind of oppressive Louisiana heat that made every breath feel like work. The small town of just over 700 residents sat nestled in St. Martin Parish, where sugarcane fields stretched toward the horizon and the Bayou Teche wound through like a dark ribbon. This was a place where 3 generations attended the same Catholic church, where Friday night high school football drew half the town to the stadium, and where neighbors didn't just know each other, they knew everything about each other. Sometimes a little too well. Vivienne Blanchard wiped the sweat from her forehead as she locked the front door of Hebert's Pharmacy on Main Street at exactly 7:30 p.m. She was 37 years old, a slender woman with shoulder-length auburn hair that she usually pulled back in a practical ponytail. For 12 years, she'd worked as a registered pharmacist, ever since graduating from the University of Louisiana at Monroe. Throughout St. Martinville, people knew her for her meticulous attention to detail, her warm smile, and her habit of calling elderly customers personally to remind them when prescriptions needed refilling. That evening, Vivienne wore her usual work attire, a pale blue blouse, navy slacks, and comfortable white sneakers. Around her neck hung a delicate gold chain with a small cross, a gift from her mother on her confirmation day. She carried a beige leather purse over her shoulder. Inside were her wallet containing 40 svetatars, her driver's license, a tube of chapstick, a small notepad, and her house keys attached to a keychain shaped like a pelican, Louisiana's state bird. Vivienne waved to old Mr. Hebert, the pharmacy owner, who was counting the register inside. She walked across the small parking lot to her car, a 1978 Chevrolet Malibu, forest green with tan interior, parked beneath the sprawling branches of a live oak tree. She started the engine, adjusted the rearview mirror, and pulled out onto Main Street, heading east toward home. It was a 12-minute drive from the pharmacy to the modest brick ranch house on Cypress Lane where she lived with her husband, Antoine, and their 15-year-old daughter, Celeste. Vivienne drove this route twice daily, 5 days a week. She knew every turn, every traffic light, every landmark. By 7:42 p.m., she should have been pulling into her driveway, the familiar hum of the Malibu's engine announcing her arrival. But that Tuesday evening, Vivienne Blanchard never made it home. Antoine Blanchard, a soft-spoken man who managed the parts department at an oil field supply company, sat at the kitchen table with a plate of reheated jambalaya waiting for his wife. Celeste was in her room, door closed, listening to the radio and doing summer reading for school. By 7:45 p.m., Antoine glanced at the clock. Vivienne was usually home by 7:42, give or take a minute or two. The pharmacy closed at 7:30 and the drive was predictable, automatic, routine. By 8 p.m., he felt the first prickle of real concern crawling up his spine. He picked up the phone and dialed Hebert's pharmacy. Mr. Hebert answered, confused by the question. Yes, Vivienne left right on time, Antoine. About 7:30, just like always. She locked the door herself. I watched her get in her car. Antoine's hands started to tremble. By 8:15 p.m., he dialed the St. Martinville Police Department, his voice tight with worry. The dispatcher, a woman named Louise, who went to church with the Blanchards, tried to reassure him. Maybe she stopped somewhere, Antoine. You know how Vivienne is, always helping somebody. Maybe she ran into a friend at the grocery store. But Antoine knew, deep in his chest, beneath his ribs, in that place where intuition lives, he knew something was terribly wrong. Vivienne didn't make unplanned stops. She didn't run errands without calling. She came home to her family every single night without fail. By 9 p.m., a patrol car was driving the route from Hebert's pharmacy to Cypress Lane. Officer Paul Thibodeau, a 28-year-old rookie, drove slowly, spotlight sweeping across ditches and side roads, looking for any sign of the green Malibu, any indication of where Vivienne might have gone. Nothing. Not a trace. Not a skid mark. Not a single piece of evidence that she'd driven this road at all. When Officer Thibodeau knocked on the Blanchard family's door at 10:30 p.m. to confirm the report, he found Antoine pacing the living room, Celeste sitting on the couch with tears streaming down her face. The officer took down details: the car's make, model, color, license plate number, Vivienne's description, what she was wearing, where she was last seen. He promised they'd keep looking, that someone would find her. But as midnight approached and the Louisiana darkness pressed in from all sides, a different kind of fear began spreading through St. Martinville. A dedicated mother, a trusted pharmacist, a woman who did everything right, had simply vanished between the pharmacy and her home. And nobody had seen a thing. The next morning, July 22nd, 1981, the disappearance of Vivienne Blanchard was the only thing anyone in St. Martinville could talk about. At LeBlanc's Café, where locals gathered for coffee and boudin before work, speculation ran wild. Did she have an accident? Was she kidnapped? Did she run away? That last theory was quickly dismissed by anyone who actually knew Vivienne. She was devoted to her family, deeply involved at Sacred Heart Catholic Church, and had absolutely no reason to leave. The St. Martinville Police Department, with only 12 full-time officers, immediately requested assistance from the Louisiana State Police. By mid-morning, Detective Raymond Guidry arrived. He was a 44-year-old veteran who'd investigated everything from highway accidents to suspected homicides across the state. His reputation was built on patience and methodical attention to detail. Detective Guidry started at the beginning. He interviewed Mr. Hebert, who confirmed that Vivienne had left at her usual time and seemed perfectly normal. Perhaps a little tired from the heat, but otherwise fine. He'd watched her walk to her car, seen her get in, saw her drive away, heading east on Main Street, toward home. Nothing unusual, nothing that raised concern. Guidry organized the community response. Within hours, volunteers mobilized. Search parties combed the roads between the pharmacy and the Blanchard home, walking through ditches, checking behind abandoned buildings, searching through sugarcane fields that bordered the highway. State police divers were brought in to search the deeper parts of the Bayou Teche, the murky water that wound through the parish and had swallowed more than one vehicle over the years. Search dogs followed Vivienne's scent from the pharmacy parking lot, but the trail ended at the street where her car had been parked. Detective Guidry sat down with Antoine and Celeste at their home on Cypress Lane. Antoine, exhausted and hollow-eyed, kept repeating the same thing. "She would never leave us. Never. Something happened to her." His voice broke as he said it, hands trembling as he gripped his coffee cup. Celeste, a slight 15-year-old girl with her mother's auburn hair and serious brown eyes, could barely speak through her tears. She described her mother as reliable, loving, always there. "She never missed my school events," Celeste whispered. "She always came home, always." Guidry checked everything. He looked into Vivienne's finances. Nothing unusual, no large withdrawals, no secret accounts, no signs of planning a disappearance. He investigated Antoine thoroughly, but the husband had a solid alibi. He'd been home with Celeste that entire evening, confirmed by a neighbor who'd stopped by to borrow a wrench around 7:15 p.m. Guidry interviewed Vivienne's co-workers, her friends, members of Sacred Heart Church. Everyone said the same thing. Vivienne was kind, reliable, content with her life. No enemies, no secrets, no reason to vanish. By the end of the first week, there was no sign of Vivienne Blanchard, no sign of her green 1978 Chevrolet Malibu. No witnesses had come forward. No body had been discovered. It was as if she had simply driven into the thick Louisiana night and ceased to exist. During the investigation, a neighbor named Clyde Trusclair came forward. He lived just 2 houses down from the Blanchards on Cypress Lane. Clyde was 34 years old, worked as a mechanic at a garage in Breaux Bridge, and was known in the neighborhood as handy and helpful. The kind of guy who'd help you fix your lawnmower or change your oil without being asked. Clyde told Detective Guidry that he'd been working on his truck in his driveway that Tuesday evening. He'd seen Vivienne drive past around 7:40 p.m., headed toward her house. He seemed genuinely concerned, volunteered to help with the search, wanted to do whatever he could. During a follow-up interview at Clyde's home, Detective Guidry noticed something. Clyde was wearing a white work shirt with what appeared to be brownish stains on the cuff and front. When asked about it, Clyde explained he'd cut his hand while working on the truck earlier that evening. He showed Guidry a bandage on his palm. Guidry asked to take the shirt for analysis. Clyde agreed without hesitation, handing it over willingly. The shirt was sent to the Louisiana State Police Lab. The stains were tested. They were blood, type A positive, the same as Vivienne's blood type. But here was the problem. Type A positive blood is shared by about 35% of the population. Clyde Trosclair himself, when asked to provide a blood sample, was also type A positive. In 1981, DNA technology didn't exist. There was no way to definitively determine whose blood was on that shirt. Blood typing could narrow possibilities, but it couldn't provide absolute identification. Without any other evidence connecting Clyde to Vivienne's disappearance, without a body, without a crime scene, the investigation had to move on. The blood-stained shirt was logged into evidence, sealed, and stored. As summer turned to fall, the active search for Vivienne Blanchard gradually faded. Detective Guidry worked the case from every possible angle, but each path led to a dead end. He'd collected fingerprints from items in Vivienne's workspace at the pharmacy, hoping they might lead somewhere if they turned up at a crime scene. He obtained samples of her handwriting in case a ransom note surfaced. He documented every detail of her last known movements, interviewed dozens of people, followed up on every tip that came through the police station. But without a crime scene, without a body, without a single witness who'd seen anything suspicious, the investigation had nowhere to go. The forensic tools available in 1981 were painfully limited compared to what we have today. Blood typing was the best option for biological evidence, but it could only tell investigators so much. Type A positive blood, like what was found on Clyde Trosclair's shirt, belonged to roughly 35% of the American population. It was Vivienne's blood type, but it was also Clyde's blood type, and the blood type of millions of other people. There was no way to prove definitively whose blood it was. Fingerprinting technology existed, but it required clear prints and a database to compare them against. The green Malibu was gone, so there was no vehicle to process for prints or evidence. The stretch of road where Vivienne should have driven home showed no signs of struggle, no skid marks, no broken glass, nothing to indicate where she might have been forced off the road or what might have happened to her. Detective Guidry kept pushing. He looked into the possibility that Vivienne had been targeted by someone passing through town, a stranger, a drifter. But St. Martinville was small, and strangers were noticed. No one recalled seeing unfamiliar vehicles or suspicious people around the time of her disappearance. He investigated whether Vivienne might have had any conflicts at work, any disputes with customers or co-workers. Nothing. Everyone at Hebert's pharmacy described her as professional, kind, someone who went out of her way to help people. He examined Antoine's background thoroughly, looking for any sign of marital problems, financial stress, anything that might suggest a motive. But the marriage was solid, the finances were stable, and Antoine's alibi was airtight. Multiple people confirmed he'd been home that evening. By October 1981, just 3 months after Vivienne vanished, the case had effectively gone cold. The story appeared less frequently in the Teshi News, the local newspaper. The volunteer search parties stopped organizing. Detective Guidry continued to work other cases, though Vivienne's file remained on his desk, a constant reminder of the one that got away. What would you do if someone you loved just vanished? No goodbye, no explanation, no trace left behind. Just gone, as if they'd never existed. Let us know in the comments below. By the end of 1981, Vivienne Blanchard's case file was moved from Detective Guidry's active desk to a storage room. Then eventually to the basement of the parish courthouse, where it was placed in a cardboard box alongside hundreds of other unsolved cases. The file contained witness statements, photographs of Vivienne, notes in Guidry's careful handwriting, evidence logs, and that blood-stained shirt sealed in a plastic bag. To the world outside her family, Vivienne Blanchard became a statistic. One more name on a long list of missing persons in Louisiana. One more cold case that would likely never be solved. The technology didn't exist to process the evidence that might have cracked it open. The witnesses didn't exist to point investigators in the right direction. The body didn't exist to provide answers about what had happened. For Detective Guidry, Vivienne's case was a weight he'd carry for the rest of his career. For the Blanchard family, it was a wound that would never heal. 38 years is a long time to wait for answers. Long enough for children to become adults, for adults to grow old, for entire lives to pass in the shadow of one unanswered question. For Antoine and Celeste Blanchard, time fractured into before and after. Before July 21, 1981, and after. Everything that came before felt like a dream, a life that belonged to different people. Everything that came after was survival. In the small living room of the house on Cypress Lane, Antoine created a space for Vivienne's memory. Her photo, taken the previous Christmas, sat on the mantel. In it, she wore a red sweater, her smile warm and alive, her eyes reflecting the camera's flash. Flanking the photo were 2 candles that Antoine lit every evening without fail. Next to them rested her reading glasses, the ones she'd used to check prescription labels at the pharmacy. A dried flower from her garden, a small wooden cross. These objects became a shrine, a place where Antoine could sit and talk to his wife as if she might somehow hear him. He continued going to work at the oil field supply company, continued paying bills, continued maintaining the house. But he was hollowed out, moving through life like a ghost. Neighbors would see him in the yard, trimming the hedges or mowing the lawn, and they'd wave, offer polite greetings. But everyone knew the man who'd once been quick with a joke, who'd hosted backyard barbecues and helped neighbors fix their cars, was gone. In his place was someone just going through the motions. Every Sunday, Antoine attended Mass at Sacred Heart Catholic Church. He'd sit in the same pew, 3 rows from the front on the left side, the same place the Blanchard family had sat for years. After the service, he'd walk to the front of the church, where rows of votive candles flickered in red glass holders. He'd light a candle for Vivienne, bow his head, and pray. Not for her to come home anymore. By the 2nd year, by the 5th year, by the 10th year, he knew she was gone. He prayed for answers, for justice, for peace he couldn't find on his own. Celeste's life unfolded in the absence of the person who should have been there for all of it. She finished her sophomore year of high school in a fog, unable to concentrate, unable to connect with friends who didn't understand what it felt like to have your mother simply disappear. She graduated in 1984, walked across the stage to receive her diploma, and looked out at the audience to see her father sitting alone, clapping with tears running down his face. The empty seat next to him was louder than any applause. She attended Northwestern State University in Natchitoches, came home with her teaching degree, got a job at the elementary school she'd once attended as a child. She met a good man named Mitchell who worked as a welder. He was patient with her, understood that there were parts of her heart that remained frozen in 1981, that there were days when grief would hit her out of nowhere and she'd need to be alone. They got married in 1992 at Sacred Heart Church. Antoine walked her down the aisle. The ceremony was beautiful, but there was a weight to it that everyone felt. Vivienne should have been there, should have helped pick out the dress, should have cried happy tears in the front pew. Instead, there was just absence. Celeste had 2 children, a daughter born in 1995, a son born in 1998. She named her daughter Vivienne, after the grandmother she would never meet. Holding her newborn baby in the hospital, Celeste wept, not just from joy, but from loss. Her mother would never hold her grandchildren, never sing them lullabies, never bake cookies with them on rainy afternoons. The children would grow up seeing photos of a woman they'd never know, hearing stories about a grandmother who vanished before they existed. Antoine, watching his grandchildren grow, aged rapidly. The man who'd been 42 when Vivienne disappeared was 58 by 1997. His hair completely gray, his shoulders stooped. He became quieter as the years passed, as if words had stopped mattering. He'd sit with little Vivienne on his lap, pointing to the photo on the mantel, saying, "That's your grandmother. She would have loved you so much." The community of St. Martinville moved on the way communities do. People who'd participated in the search parties got busy with their own lives, raising children, dealing with their own struggles. The oil industry crashed in the mid-1980s, devastating the local economy. Families fought to survive, to keep their homes, to find work. Vivienne's disappearance became an old story, something people mentioned occasionally in hushed tones, but no longer the center of daily conversation. But the Blanchard family remained frozen. Every holiday, every birthday, every milestone was marked by who wasn't there. The dining table still had an empty chair. Vivienne's clothes still hung in the closet because Antoine couldn't bring himself to give them away. Her perfume bottles still sat on the dresser, the scent long faded, but the bottles untouched. Detective Guidry retired from the Louisiana State Police in 1995. He'd solved dozens of cases over his career, brought closure to many families, but Vivienne Blanchard's disappearance haunted him. In his final weeks before retirement, he'd pulled her file one last time, read through every page, hoping something would jump out that he'd missed. Nothing did. He left the force knowing he'd failed her family, failed to bring justice. 16 years passed, then 20, then 30, still no answers. But while the Blanchard family waited in St. Martinville, the world of forensic science was transforming. In the mid-1980s, DNA fingerprinting was developed. By the late 1990s, the FBI launched CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database of DNA profiles. Technology that didn't exist in 1981 was now standard procedure. Cold cases that had seemed unsolvable were being reopened, re-examined with new tools. In 2018, the Golden State Killer, a serial predator who'd terrorized California for decades, was finally identified and arrested using forensic genetic genealogy. The breakthrough sent waves through law enforcement across the country. Cases that had been cold for 40, even 50 years, suddenly had hope. And in a courthouse basement in St. Martin Parish, Louisiana, a cardboard box labeled Blanchard, Vivienne, 1981, waited in the dark. In the spring of 2019, the Louisiana State Police made a decision that would change everything for families like the Blanchards. They established a dedicated cold case unit, staffed by experienced detectives and equipped with funding specifically for re-examining unsolved cases using modern technology. The success of forensic genetic genealogy in cracking decades-old cases had proven one thing. Evidence that seemed useless in the past could now provide definitive answers. Detective Marlene Savoy was assigned to lead the review of cold cases from St. Martin Parish. She was 46 years old, a veteran investigator from Lafayette, with a reputation for tenacity and a personal commitment to giving victims a voice. She'd seen too many cases filed away and forgotten, too many families left without closure. For Savoy, every cold case file represented a real person whose story deserved to be finished. On a humid April morning, Detective Savoy walked into the climate-controlled basement storage room in the parish courthouse. Metal shelves lined the walls, stacked with cardboard boxes containing decades of forgotten investigations. She ran her finger along the labels, reading names and dates. Some cases were from the 1970s, others from the 80s and 90s. Each box represented someone's worst day, someone's unanswered prayers. Then she found it, a box labeled Blanchard, Vivienne, 1981. Savoy pulled the box from the shelf and carried it to a table. She opened it carefully, the cardboard worn and brittle after 38 years. Inside were yellowed reports, photographs of a woman with auburn hair and a kind smile, handwritten notes in Detective Guidry's careful script, witness statements, maps of St. Martinville with routes marked in red ink. She spread the contents across the table and began reading. The story unfolded page by page. A dedicated pharmacist driving home from work, a 12-minute route she'd driven thousands of times, a husband waiting with dinner, a daughter listening to the radio in her room, and then nothing. No trace, no evidence, no answers. Detective Savoy read through the witness statements, the search reports, the forensic analyses from 1981. Everything had been done correctly, given the limitations of the time. Detective Guidry had been thorough, professional, persistent, but the tools just weren't there. Then she noticed something in the evidence log. Among the items collected during the initial weeks of the case was a white work shirt belonging to Clyde Trusclair, a neighbor who lived 2 houses down from the Blanchards. The log noted that the shirt had brownish stains on the cuff and front. Blood stains. Type A positive, the same as Vivienne's blood type, but also the same as Clyde's own blood type, and the same as 35% of the population. Detective Guidry's notes explained that Trosclair had cut his hand while working on his truck. He'd volunteered the shirt willingly, seemed genuinely concerned about Vivienne's disappearance, wanted to help in any way he could. Without additional evidence connecting him to the case, the investigation had moved on. But now, 38 years later, Detective Savoy had something Detective Guidry didn't: DNA technology. She located the evidence bag in the box. The shirt was still there, sealed in plastic. The fabric yellowed with age, but the bloodstains still visible, preserved. Savoy packaged it carefully and sent it to the Louisiana State Police Crime Laboratory in Baton Rouge with a priority request for DNA analysis. The lab technicians extracted DNA from the dried bloodstains on the shirt's cuff and front. It was delicate work, handling evidence nearly 4 decades old, but modern techniques could pull genetic profiles from the smallest samples. They generated a complete STR profile, the genetic fingerprint unique to one individual. The lab needed a comparison sample. Detective Savoy contacted Celeste, now 43 years old, a mother herself, a woman who'd spent her entire adult life without answers about what happened to her mother. Celeste agreed immediately to provide a DNA sample. 6 weeks passed, 6 weeks of waiting, of hoping, of knowing this could finally be the break the case needed. Then the email arrived. Detective Savoy opened the encrypted file in her office, her heart pounding as she read the results. The DNA from the bloodstains on Clyde Trosclair's shirt had been compared to Celeste's DNA. The lab had run the analysis multiple times to confirm. The results were definitive. The blood was a maternal match to Celeste. The probability of it being anyone other than her biological mother was statistically impossible. The blood on Clyde Trosclair's shirt belonged to Vivienne Blanchard, not his own blood from a cut hand, not blood from some unrelated incident. Vivienne's blood. On the shirt of a man who'd lived 2 houses away, who'd inserted himself into the search, who'd played the role of concerned neighbor while keeping a secret for 38 years. Detective Savoy sat back in her chair, her hands trembling slightly. After nearly 4 decades, the case had just cracked wide open. The helpful neighbor who'd volunteered to search for Vivienne, who'd seemed genuinely worried about her disappearance, had her blood on his shirt the night she vanished. But Savoy knew this was just the beginning. DNA evidence proved Clyde Trosclair had come into contact with Vivienne's blood. Now she needed to build an airtight case. She needed to find out what happened that July night. And most importantly, she needed to find Vivienne. Detective Savoy knew that DNA evidence alone, while powerful, needed context. She needed to understand who Clyde Trosclair was in 1981 and who he'd become in the 38 years since Vivienne vanished. She began pulling records, building a timeline, reconstructing the life of a man who'd hidden in plain sight for nearly 4 decades. In July 1981, Clyde Trosclair was 34 years old. He worked as a mechanic at Boudreaux's garage in Breaux Bridge, about 15 minutes from St. Martinville. Co-workers from that time, the few who were still alive and could remember, described him as quiet, competent with engines, kept to himself. Not particularly friendly, but not hostile either. Just someone who showed up, did his work, and went home. He lived on Cypress Lane, just 2 houses down from the Blanchards. His house was a small wooden structure, painted white, set back from the road with a gravel driveway. He'd lived there since 1978, renting it first, then purchasing the property in 1980. His wife, Donna, worked at a laundromat and was known for keeping to herself as well. Clyde had volunteered as an assistant coach for the local youth baseball league. Parents remembered him as reliable, someone who'd help set up equipment and take it down after games. He didn't have children of his own, but seemed interested in being part of the community. In the immediate aftermath of Vivienne's disappearance, neighbors recalled seeing Clyde join the search parties. He'd walked the roads, checked the ditches, asked Antoine if there was anything he could do to help. When Detective Guidry interviewed him, Clyde had been cooperative, even concerned. He'd provided the blood-stained shirt without hesitation, given a logical explanation, seemed like exactly what he appeared to be. A regular guy, a good neighbor, someone trying to help. But Detective Savoy knew better now. She knew what investigators in 1981 couldn't have known. That helpful neighbor had Vivienne's blood on his shirt. Savoy dug deeper into Clyde's life after 1981. His marriage to Donna fell apart quickly. They divorced in 1985, less than 4 years after Vivienne disappeared. Court records showed Donna cited irreconcilable differences, but there were no details, no allegations of abuse or infidelity documented. She'd moved to Texas shortly after the divorce and died in 2003. Clyde sold the house on Cypress Lane in 1986 and moved to the outskirts of St. Martinville, purchasing a small house on a half-acre lot surrounded by woods. More isolated, more private, away from the neighbors who might remember him from the search parties. He continued working as a mechanic for various shops around the parish. In 1992, he remarried, a quiet widow named Betty, who'd lost her first husband to cancer. They lived together in the small house until Betty died in 2015 from complications related to diabetes. By 2019, Clyde Trosclair was 72 years old, living alone in that same house. His truck, a newer, model Ford F-150, sat in the driveway. The property was neat but unremarkable. A metal storage shed stood behind the house. Woods pressed in on 3 sides. Detective Savoy presented her findings to an assistant district attorney. The DNA evidence, Clyde's proximity to the victim, his involvement in the search, his timeline, the divorce shortly after Vivienne's disappearance. Everything pointed to a man who'd committed a terrible act and spent 38 years living as if nothing had happened. On May 15, 2019, a judge signed a search warrant for Clyde Trosclair's property. If you're enjoying this investigation, hit that like button and share this video so more people can learn Vivienne's story. Detective Savoy assembled a team: crime scene technicians, forensic specialists, uniformed officers, cadaver dogs. They would execute the warrant at dawn, before Clyde had a chance to realize what was happening, before he could destroy evidence or flee. As Savoy reviewed the plan the night before, she thought about Vivienne Blanchard, now 80 years old, still lighting candles every Sunday. She thought about Celeste, who'd grown up without a mother, raised children without a grandmother present. She thought about Vivienne, whose photo smiled from that mantle, frozen at 37 years old. 38 years was a long time to wait for justice. But justice, Detective Savoy believed, was finally coming. October 17, 2019. Dawn broke over St. Martinville, the air cool and crisp, autumn finally pushing back against Louisiana's relentless heat. At 6:42 a.m., a convoy of police vehicles rolled slowly down the rural road leading to Clyde Trosclair's property. Detective Savoy sat in the lead car, her jaw set, her mind focused. This was the moment 38 years in the making. The vehicles stopped at the end of the gravel driveway. Officers stepped out, uniformed and plain-clothed, moving with practiced efficiency. 2 cadaver dogs, German shepherds trained to detect human remains, pulled at their leashes, eager to work. Crime scene technicians carried equipment cases toward the property line. Detective Savoy and 2 uniformed officers approached the front door. She knocked firmly, 3 sharp raps that echoed in the quiet morning. Lights were on inside, movement behind the curtains. Clyde Trosclair opened the door wearing pajama pants and a faded LSU t-shirt. He was 72 now, his hair completely white, his face lined with age. His eyes went wide when he saw the officers, the vehicles, the dogs. "Clyde Trosclair?" Detective Savoy held up the search warrant. "I'm Detective Marlene Savoy with Louisiana State Police. We have a warrant to search your property." His face went pale. For a long moment, he just stood there, frozen in the doorway, staring at the paper in Savoy's hand. Then he spoke, his voice hoarse and shaking. "What is this about?" "Vivienne Blanchard," Savoy said evenly, watching his reaction. Something flickered across his face. Fear, recognition, resignation. He stepped back from the door without another word. Officers entered the house, securing Clyde in the living room while the search team fanned out across the property. The house itself was modest, cluttered, but not filthy. An old recliner faced a television. Dishes were stacked in the sink. Everything appeared ordinary, unremarkable. But it was outside where the secrets lived. The half-acre lot was overgrown, thick with weeds and brush that hadn't been maintained in years. The woods pressed close on 3 sides, creating a wall of privacy. Behind the house stood a metal storage shed, its roof rusted, its door secured with a heavy padlock. One of the officers moved past the shed, pushing through waist-high grass and tangled vines, following the cadaver dogs who'd picked up a scent and were pulling hard toward the back corner of the property. That's when he saw it. Partially hidden by decades of growth, covered in vines and small trees that had sprouted around it, was the rusted shell of a vehicle. The officer called out, and within seconds, the entire team was converging on the spot. They pulled away the vines, cleared the brush, revealing what had been hidden for 38 years. A 1978 Chevrolet Malibu, forest green, though the paint was faded and peeling, eaten by rust and time. Louisiana license plate still attached, though barely readable. The tires were flat, rotted. Away! Nature had tried to reclaim it, wrapping it in vegetation, but the car was unmistakable. Detective Savoy's heart pounded as she approached. The windows were covered in grime and moss. She moved to the trunk, where one of the cadaver dogs was pawing frantically, whining. The trunk was slightly ajar, the latch corroded. A crime scene technician carefully opened it. Inside, wrapped in what had once been a heavy tarp but was now deteriorated and torn, were human remains. Skeletal, the bones yellowed with age, clothing reduced to fragments. But enough remained to tell the story. A woman's blouse, pale blue, the fabric mostly rotted away. A gold chain with a small cross, tarnished but intact. A leather purse, cracked and falling apart, its contents still inside. A wallet with a driver's license bearing the name Vivienne Marie Blanchard. The remains were carefully documented, photographed, prepared for transport to the state crime lab. The medical examiner would conduct a full analysis, but even at the scene, it was clear. The skull showed evidence of blunt force trauma, a fracture along the left side, consistent with being struck with significant force. Vivienne had been here the entire time, 38 years, hidden in the trunk of her own car, on the property of the man who'd killed her. While Antoine lit candles and prayed for answers, while Celeste grew up and had children of her own, while search parties combed ditches and dragged the bayou, Vivienne had been less than 2 miles from her home. And Clyde Trosclair had known. Every single day for 38 years, he'd known. Back in the living room, Detective Savoy sat down across from Clyde. He was handcuffed now, his head down, his shoulders slumped. She read him his rights, asked if he understood. He nodded without speaking. "We found her, Clyde," Savoy said quietly. "We found Vivienne. We found her car. We found everything." He didn't respond, didn't look up. Over the next hours, as the investigation unfolded on his property, pieces of the truth began to emerge. Through subsequent interviews, through evidence collected, through the careful reconstruction of events from July 1981, a terrible story took shape. Clyde Trosclair had been obsessed with Vivienne Blanchard. He'd lived 2 houses down, watched her leave for work every morning, watched her come home every evening. She was beautiful, kind, seemed to have the perfect life. And he wanted her. He'd made advances. Subtle at first, offering to help with yard work, showing up when Antoine was at work. Vivienne had been polite but firm in her rejections. She was married, devoted to her family, not interested. She'd mentioned it to Antoine, who'd planned to speak with Clyde if it continued. But on July 21st, 1981, something had shifted. Clyde had been drinking. He'd worked himself into a state, convinced himself that Vivienne was just playing hard to get, that she wanted him but was too shy to admit it. He'd followed her when she left the pharmacy. He knew her route, knew the stretch of road that ran past sugarcane fields with no witnesses, no houses, no one to see. He forced her off the road, confronted her. When she tried to drive away, he struck her through the open car window with a tire iron he'd grabbed from his truck. She died quickly, the blow crushing her skull. Panicked, realizing what he'd done, he'd driven both vehicles to his property under cover of darkness. He'd hidden her car behind his house, covered it with a tarp, began the work of concealing it completely. And he'd inserted himself into the search, played the concerned neighbor, offered sympathy to Antoine while keeping the darkest secret imaginable. For 38 years, Clyde Trosclair had lived with murder. He'd gone to work, come home, mowed his lawn, remarried, attended church, all while Vivienne's body remained hidden just steps from his back door. The news hit St. Martinville like a physical blow. Within hours of Clyde Trosclair's arrest, word spread through the small town. At LeBlanc's Cafe, at the grocery store, at Sacred Heart Church, at every gas station and gathering place, people talked about nothing else. Vivienne Blanchard had been found, and the man who'd killed her had been living among them for nearly 4 decades. The helpful neighbor, the guy who'd joined the search parties, the man who'd volunteered his time coaching youth baseball, who'd offered sympathy to Antoine, who'd seemed as concerned as anyone about what had happened to Vivienne. He'd been the killer all along. For people who'd lived through 1981, who'd walked those roads looking for any sign of Vivienne, the revelation was devastating. They'd trusted him. Some had considered him a friend. He'd stood shoulder to shoulder with them, searching ditches and fields, all while knowing exactly where she was. Detective Savoy drove to the Blanchard home to deliver the news in person. Antoine was 73 now, moving slowly, his hand shaking as he opened the door. When Savoy told him they'd found Vivienne, that she'd been on Clyde Trosclair's property all these years, the old man's legs nearly gave out. Celeste, who'd rushed over when she heard police were coming, caught her father's arm and helped him to a chair. Antoine sat in silence for a long time, staring at his hands. Then he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. I walked past his house 1,000 times, 1,000 times, going to the store, walking to church, driving to work. He'd wave at me like everything was normal, like he couldn't finish the sentence. Celeste's reaction was different. Relief washed over her first, tears streaming down her face. After 38 years of not knowing, of imagining every terrible possibility, she finally had answers. Her mother hadn't suffered for days or weeks. The death had been quick, brutal, but quick. And now there would be justice. But relief quickly turned to rage. Clyde Trosclair had stolen her mother from her. He'd taken away graduations, wedding planning, the chance to introduce her children to their grandmother. He'd watched the family suffer for decades, watched them age and grieve and break apart, all while keeping his secret. He was at my high school graduation, Celeste said, her voice shaking with fury. He came up to me afterward and told me how proud my mother would have been. He looked me in the eye and said that. St. Martinville struggled to process the betrayal. How do you reconcile the image of a quiet mechanic, someone you'd known for years, with the reality of what he'd done? How do you trust your neighbors, your community, when evil can hide in such plain sight? Sacred Heart Church held a prayer service 3 days after the arrest. The pews were packed. Father Benoit, who'd been at the church for only 5 years and hadn't known Vivienne, spoke about truth, justice, and the long road to healing. Antoine sat in his usual pew, Celeste beside him, surrounded by people who'd known and loved Vivienne. The community was reeling, trying to understand how they'd been so completely fooled. Have you ever trusted someone who turned out to be completely different than who you thought they were? Someone who betrayed that trust in a way that made you question everything? Share your thoughts below. The betrayal cut deeper because of the proximity. Clyde hadn't been a stranger passing through town. He'd been a neighbor, part of the community, someone who'd shared their streets and their churches and their daily lives. For 38 years, he'd walked among them, carrying a secret that would shatter everything they thought they knew about him. March 2021. Nearly 2 years after Clyde Trosclair's arrest, his trial began at the St. Martin Parish Courthouse. The building was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled with reporters, community members, and family. Antoine sat in the front row, frail but determined. Celeste sat beside him, her hand gripping his, both of them staring at the man who'd destroyed their lives. Clyde Trosclair, now 73 years old, sat at the defense table wearing an orange jumpsuit, his white hair neatly combed, his face expressionless. He'd aged visibly in the 2 years since his arrest, the weight of his secret finally exposed after nearly 4 decades. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Marcus Hebert, presented a case that was both straightforward and devastating. He walked the jury through the timeline of July 21, 1981. A woman leaving work, driving home to her family, never arriving. A neighbor who'd inserted himself into the search, who'd volunteered information, who'd played the role of concerned citizen. Then came the evidence. The blood-stained shirt, sealed in evidence for 38 years, was displayed for the jury. DNA analysis had proven definitively that the blood belonged to Vivienne Blanchard. Not to Clyde himself, despite his claim of cutting his hand. Not to anyone else. Only Vivienne. Crime scene photographs showed the rusted Malibu hidden behind Clyde's house, wrapped in vines and decades of growth. The images were haunting. A car that should have carried a woman safely home instead became her tomb. The medical examiner testified about the remains found in the trunk. She described the blunt force trauma to the skull, the fracture pattern consistent with being struck with a heavy object. She explained how the injury would have caused rapid death, likely within minutes. Former neighbors testified about Clyde's behavior in 1981, how he'd joined search parties, how he'd offered sympathy to Antoine, how he'd seemed genuinely concerned, genuinely helpful. The prosecution made it clear, Clyde hadn't just killed Vivienne. He'd spent 38 years watching her family suffer, participating in their grief, all while hiding the truth. The defense tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that the passage of time made facts unclear, that Clyde had cooperated fully in 1981. His attorney, a public defender named Robert Landry, suggested that perhaps someone else had placed the car on Clyde's property without his knowledge, that perhaps he'd been framed. But the argument fell apart under scrutiny. How would someone move a car onto Clyde's property without him noticing? How would they access his land? Why would the victim's blood be on Clyde's shirt if he had nothing to do with her disappearance? And why, if he was innocent, had he never mentioned seeing the car in 38 years? Clyde never took the stand. His attorney advised against it, knowing that prosecutors would destroy him under cross-examination. On March 18, 2021, after 4 days of testimony, closing arguments were delivered. The jury retired to deliberate at 2:15 p.m. They returned at 4:52 p.m., less than 3 hours. The courtroom stood as the jury filed back in. The foreman, a middle-aged woman who worked as a nurse, held a folded piece of paper. The judge asked for the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Clyde Joseph Trosclair, guilty of second-degree murder." The words hung in the air. Antoine's shoulders shook with silent sobs. Celeste closed her eyes, tears running down her face. Across the courtroom, others wept openly. Clyde showed no reaction. He sat motionless, staring straight ahead, as if he'd expected nothing else. 2 weeks later, the judge handed down the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 73 years old, it was effectively a death sentence. Clyde would die behind bars, never again walking free, never again living among the community he'd deceived for so long. Justice, delayed by 38 years, had finally arrived. But for the Blanchard family, there was still one more thing that needed to happen. Vivienne deserved to be laid to rest properly, with dignity, with the ceremony that should have taken place in 1981. On April 10, 2021, Sacred Heart Catholic Church held a funeral mass for Vivienne Marie Blanchard, the same church where she'd attended services every Sunday, the same church where Antoine had lit candles for her every week for 38 years, the same church where Celeste had been baptized, confirmed, and married. The casket was closed, a spray of white roses across the top. Photos of Vivienne surrounded the altar, her smile, her warmth, frozen in time at 37 years old. Father Benoit led the service, speaking about loss, faith, and the long journey toward peace. Then Celeste stood to deliver the eulogy. Her voice was steady, strengthened by the knowledge that her mother's story was finally complete. "My mother was kind," Celeste began. "She helped people. She called elderly patients to remind them about their medications. She stayed late at the pharmacy if someone needed to talk. She made me breakfast every morning and asked about my day every evening. She deserved to live a long life. She deserved to see me graduate, to walk me down the aisle, to hold her grandchildren." Her voice hardened. For 38 years, a man who called himself a neighbor stole all of that from her, from us. But today, we reclaim her story. We honor her memory not as a victim, but as a woman who was loved, who made a difference, who mattered. And we demand that her death means something, that justice was served, that truth, no matter how long it takes, will always come to light. The church was silent, except for the sound of people weeping. Vivienne was buried at St. Michael's Cemetery, beside her parents, beneath a live oak tree. Her headstone read, "Vivienne Marie Blanchard, beloved wife, mother, friend, 1944-1981. Finally, home. The case of Vivienne Blanchard isn't just one family's tragedy. It's a window into the reality of cold cases across America. Right now, there are thousands of unsolved murders and disappearances sitting in storage rooms and courthouse basements, waiting for someone to reopen the files, to look at old evidence with new eyes and new technology. What happened to Vivienne teaches us several crucial lessons about justice, persistence, and the nature of evil hiding in plain sight. First, the investigation failures in 1981 weren't the result of incompetence or laziness. Detective Raymond Guidry did everything right with the tools available to him. He collected evidence, interviewed witnesses, followed every lead, documented everything meticulously. The blood-stained shirt was preserved properly, sealed, and stored. But in 1981, blood typing was the best forensic science could offer. It could narrow possibilities, but couldn't provide definitive identification. DNA technology simply didn't exist yet. This is the reality for thousands of cold cases. The investigators did their jobs well. They just didn't have access to the tools we have today. Modern DNA analysis, forensic genetic genealogy, improved databases, and advanced laboratory techniques have transformed what's possible. Evidence that seemed useless decades ago can now provide answers that seemed impossible. The Vivienne Blanchard case also reveals something uncomfortable about trust within communities. St. Martinville was a small town where everyone knew everyone. That familiarity created a sense of safety, but it also created blind spots. Clyde Trosclair was a neighbor, a familiar face, someone who fit seamlessly into daily life. People trusted him because he was one of them. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who seem the most ordinary. Predators often hide behind masks of normalcy. They're the helpful neighbor, the volunteer coach, the guy who waves at you from his driveway. They count on our natural inclination to trust people who seem like us, who live near us, who participate in our communities. Clyde Trosclair understood this instinctively by inserting himself into the search for Vivienne, by expressing concern and offering help. He positioned himself as above suspicion. But perhaps the most important lesson from this case is about persistence and hope. For 38 years, Antoine and Celeste Blanchard lived without answers. They could have given up, could have accepted that they'd never know the truth. Instead, they kept Vivienne's memory alive. They cooperated with investigators. They waited. And when Detective Marlene Savoy opened that cardboard box in 2019, when she saw the potential in evidence collected decades earlier, she didn't dismiss it as too old or too complicated. She pursued it. She used the tools available in 2019 that weren't available in 1981. She gave the Blanchard family what they'd been waiting for. Every cold case file represents a real person. A daughter, a mother, a wife, a friend. Someone who mattered to people, whose absence left a hole that never healed. Behind every file folder and evidence box is a family still waiting, still hoping for answers. The rise of forensic genetic genealogy, the technique used to catch the Golden State Killer and solve hundreds of other cold cases, has opened doors that were previously locked. Cases that seemed hopeless are being solved. Families that had resigned themselves to never knowing are getting phone calls from detectives saying, "We found them. We know what happened." Justice delayed is not justice denied. Sometimes it just takes time, technology, and someone willing to look again at evidence everyone else had forgotten. Vivienne Blanchard waited 38 years for justice, but justice came. Vivienne Marie Blanchard didn't get to see her daughter graduate. She didn't walk her down the aisle. She never held her grandchildren, but she wasn't forgotten. For 38 years, her family kept her memory alive, refusing to let her become just another statistic, just another name on a cold case list. And because of their persistence, because of advances in DNA technology, because a dedicated cold case detective opened a dusty box and refused to give up, Vivienne's story finally reached its conclusion. Not the ending her family hoped for, but an ending nonetheless. The truth came out. Justice was served. Antoine Blanchard passed away in December 2022 at the age of 83. He died knowing what happened to his wife, knowing the man who took her from him would spend the rest of his life in prison. The candles he'd lit every Sunday for 38 years finally stopped, but his devotion to Vivienne never did. Celeste continues to live in St. Martinville, raising awareness about cold cases and advocating for families still waiting for answers. She speaks at victims' rights conferences, reminding people that every unsolved case represents a real family trapped in an endless cycle of grief and uncertainty. There are thousands of cases like Vivienne's across America. Boxes sitting in storage, evidence waiting to be re-examined, families still hoping. DNA technology is giving these cases new life, new possibilities. What seemed impossible 30 years ago is routine today. Thank you for joining us on this journey for justice. If you believe no one deserves to be forgotten, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Which cold case do you want us to cover next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. Let us know which mysteries demand answers, which families deserve closure. See you in the next video where we uncover more buried secrets and bring light to the forgotten. Because no matter how long it takes, no matter how deep the lies go, truth has a way of finding the light. Always.